Hello, my name is Deborah Dwork, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth of a year-long virtual series on the marginalized and the erased. The historical record is marked by voids, elided events, disappeared people, erased accounts, marginalized communities. This series tackles a number of those blank spots in history and in our own time. I thank our series partners, NYU's Professor Emerita of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, Marian Kaplan, and Stockton University Professor Raz Segal. I thank too Center Associate Juan Acevedo, on whose help I rely, Dr. Eli Karetny, Deputy Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute, for his support, and the GC's terrific IT people. Above all, I am grateful to our speakers and to everyone who has tuned in. Thank you for your engagement. It is now my pleasure to introduce Amos Goldberg, the chair of our panel, and it is he who has the honor of introducing our speakers. Amos holds the Jonah Macover Chair in Holocaust Studies in the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He heads the Avraham Harman Research Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the same institution. An audacious scholar, Amos's analyses of the past and of the present are as unflinching as they are erudite. Both qualities, his encyclopedic knowledge and his steadfast honesty, shine bright in his scholarship, public engagement, and teaching. I have learned from him over and over again. His books push me, actually demand of me, to rethink questions long held as settled. Not only what to think about the past, but how to think about the past. I mentioned just two of his works, Trauma in First Person, Diary Writing During the Holocaust, which probes the effects of violent oppression on the inner self, and a co-edited volume with the sociologist and political scientist Bashir Bashir, The Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history. Which brings us to our panel today, which I hasten to say came into being thanks to the generosity of our speakers, Areej and Yaacov, and our chair, Amos. Amos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deborah, very much for this very generous introduction of myself. And I really thank you and all, Deborah, and all the institutions sponsoring and the individuals organizing this important event. You are an example of academic leadership. I will frame this talk within what's happening today in Israel. We're experiencing today in Israel a very dramatic and very frightening political moment. The constitutional basis of this country, that actually lacks a constitution, is remade. The three classical branches of government are restructured to collapse into the executive branch, the government, in order to become an authoritarian regime. I participated in some of the demonstrations in Jerusalem, including the big one just 2 days ago. It was huge, between 100,000 to 360,000 participants are estimated to have participated, depends who you ask. but there were very few Palestinians there. They could not feel welcome within the sea of Israeli flags, while Palestinian flags were practically banned. Palestinians and liberal Jews tend to experience the events very differently. All are appalled and frightened, but while liberal Israelis tend, again, this is of course not clear-cut, but some kind of a gross typology, Israeli Jews tend to think of it in terms of revolution, which turns Israel from being a liberal democracy to become a totalitarian regime. Similar to Turkey or Hungary, Palestinians tend to see it, again, not all Palestinians, but in terms of typology, as a continuation of a long historical process and an almost inevitable outcome of the settler colonial setting of this country and its apartheid regime that it established since 1948. I think more or less is the same could be said about the archives, which is our theme today. All agree that there are big problems in the Israeli archives. They conceal much more than they reveal, but only a small portion of the files are open to the public to see. The Mossad and the Shabak, the two main secret services, archives are completely sealed, and to the best of my knowledge. And I was told by Adam Raz, another expert in archives, the IDF archive opened only some 56,000 files out of 12 million, which is 0.5%. Nonetheless, I think Palestinian scholars and liberal Israeli scholars tend to perceive the Israeli archives very differently, while many, again, typologically liberal Jews approach the archive for not adhering to democratic standards. Many Palestinians see it as yet another hostile settler colonial institution, even if it could bring some benefit under certain circumstances. And also the experience physically encountering the archivists and in the archives themselves are very different. Today, we have two very eminent scholars, both are experts on Israeli archives. After I introduce to talk about these issues or other issues that they will choose to talk about, after I introduce them, they will talk for about 15 minutes each. Then we will open the floor for questions. You are most invited to post your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom bar already during the talks, and don't wait for them to the end. So we will have some 20 or 25 minutes talk, Q&A, and we will close in 1 hour. First will speak Dr. Yaacov Lozowick, Israel Chief Archivist, 2011-2018, and currently running research project into the history of Israel settlement project at the Taub Center for Israel Studies at New York University. And he's also a proud grandpa. He will talk on Israel's national archives, online or blocked. Second will speak Dr. Areej Sabbagh-Khoury, Senior Lecturer of Sociology and Anthropology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research interests lie in political and historical sociology, settler colonialism, memory, gender, indigenous studies, and critical social theory. Her forthcoming book, Colonizing Palestine, The Zionist Left and the Making of the Palestinian Nakba by Stanford University Press, is coming soon. And it examines encounters between kibbutz settlers and Palestinian inhabitants in northern Palestine, Israel Valley, before, during, and after 1948. I would add, from my personal knowledge, she's a proud mother too. So Yaacov, please go ahead.
Thank you, Amos, for the invitation. Thank you, Deborah, for the greater invitation, and thank all of those participants who've come to listen to us this evening. It's evening here in Jerusalem. I'm speaking in two capacities. Between 2011 and 2018, I was the state archivist, which means basically I was the head of Israel's national archives and of various other entities. And then in late 2018, I left that job and crossed the lines, and literally the next week became a major one of the major users of the archive system in a project in which we have ordered millions of pages of documentation, and some of them we've gotten. So I'm bringing two perspectives, as I said, one about the person running the archives and trying to give as good as possible service to the public. And then following on that, a user who is much more aware of the failures of the system. So let me start with the good news. The good news is that for those of us who use archival documentation, and archival documentation is exceedingly important if you want to understand all sorts of aspects of the past, not all of them, but many. So for those of you, us who use archival documentation, some of the archival documentation of the State of Israel is actually very, very easily accessible. Let me start with the best place of all. The best place of all is the website of the Knesset, which has simply put up on its website just about all of the protocols and the deliberations of the plenum and of the committees since the beginning of the state. And it's all up there. Maybe not all of it, but almost all of it is up there. And what is not yet on is going on starting from 1948 until this morning. Any meeting or deliberation in the Knesset today will be online tomorrow at the latest. It's not very searchable. It's you have to know what you're looking for in order to find it. But if you know what you're looking for, you can find it. And just this morning, not in connection with this meeting, I had a discussion with the head of the woman who runs their archive, and she was telling me, among other things, about the project they have now of constructing very intelligent search engine capacities that they don't yet have, and she hopes that at some point in the near future they will have that and make the material even more accessible. So that's the Knesset. At the opposite end of the Knesset, as Amos mentioned, the intelligence agencies, there's the Mossad and the Shabak, and there's some of those, and some of the intelligence agencies of the military are basically sealed. For all practical purposes, those materials are not going to be open in our lifetime. For better or for worse, it can be explained, it can be justified. It's not a particularly good thing. It's a fact. However, those agencies produce only a very small percentage of the archival records of the State of Israel and the government of the State of Israel. So the fact that it's all sealed is problematic, but doesn't affect the broader picture. In the broader picture, there are two major archives. Legally, they're the same archive, but in reality, there are two archives: the State Archive and the Military Archive. Theoretically, the Military Archive is subordinate to the State Archive and is part of it, but in reality, it doesn't work that way, and the State Archive has very little influence over what happens in the Military Archive. When I was a state archivist, they were always very respectful and deferent to me as long as I did exactly what they wanted. In other words, if I was the front for their for whatever they were doing, then they gave me all the respect to somebody who has a high position and represents them. The moment I tried not to toe their line, I found that I had absolutely no power whatsoever. And the State Archive. The State Archive is probably the largest, depending how you measure it. And the State Archive contains all of the documentation of the government of the State of Israel, meaning the government ministries. There is material there from the president's ministry, which is actually not a ministry. There's some material from the military agencies, and there's a lot of material which are not from ministries at all, but from various other agencies in the general administration of the State of Israel. About 10 years ago, the government, the cabinet, in a process in which I was very proud to participate, decided to put what for archives are very large sums of money, of hundreds of millions of dollars, to pour them onto the state archives in order that the state archives go online. And to the best of my knowledge, even today, the State of Israel is one of the few countries in the world, I know of two, but there could be another one or two that I'm not aware of. The United States is not one of them, where there is the intention to put the entire archival record online, everything, online for free and online for use by anybody wherever they are and whenever they are, and when there's a lockdown because of COVID, then the archives remain open because they're open. That was the attempt, and between the moment the government made that decision until I left in 2018, we made significant strides in achieving that goal, such that today I'm not there anymore, and I try and stay away from them. I don't know the number today, but my estimate is that there are 50 or 60 million pages of documentation online at the website of the Israel State Archive, and they're there, and anybody can go and use them. The archive is continuing to put online materials according to their own reports to the tune of about, let's say, 40 or 50,000 files a year, times 100, so that'll give you 440. They're putting on a couple more million of pages every year. So that's the good news. If what you're interested in has already been opened, it's a smallish percentage, but it's not tiny. If what you're interested in has already been opened, then it's there. And if what you're interested in has not yet been opened, you can order it, and they will open it for you free of charge and put it online for you and for everybody to see it. And that's the end of the good news. Now we go to the bad news. The bad news is that far more documentation is not online than is online. And the rate of opening, I said 40 or 50,000 files a year, is actually smaller than the rate of documentation which should be going online according to law. According to law, documentation which is 15 years old should be online. And unless it's diplomatic or classified secret to a certain extent, in which case it waits 25 years or 30 years or 50 years. And there are some issues of privacy that keep it sealed even longer. But privacy issues, for example, very rarely will keep a file sealed, because since it's all digital and it's all online, the archive has figured out, wasn't very hard to do, has figured out a way of redacting names in such a way that the entire file can go online minus the names, minus the identification. So the archives have a tremendous backlog, and the backlog is growing every year. There's more material that comes of age and should be online than is opened. The second thing is that even when you do order something, and as a general rule, in most cases, what the archive does is it opens what's being ordered. In other words, they would like to have enough resources to open systematically entire segments of the archive, but they don't have those resources. And in reality, most of what is open every year is what the public has ordered. And from my own personal experience, I can tell you that when you order material, you sometimes will get it within a week. It'll come online for you. And sometimes it takes 3 or 4 years. And why does it sometimes take 3 or 4 years? Well, this is a big and tough question, and I'm given the very few minutes that I have here, I'm not going to delve into it in any great depth. I will say that there are basically a number of motivations for slowing down the process of opening the archival material. The largest motivation is that the archive does not have the budget and the funds and the resources to deal with the problem. But on the other hand, it's also not doing its best to utilize the resources that it does have and the possibilities that it does have. So that is an excuse which they love to use, but which I find only partially convincing. There's something to it, but it's not as convincing as they would like you to believe when they say we don't have the resources to be doing this job. The second reason is that there's material in there they don't want you to see. But here, actually, the reality is that this is not a major issue. The archives don't have their act together, and they're working much slower than they ought to be. But it's not primarily because they're trying to keep specific things secret. And the proof of that is in the fact that you look at what they have opened, and you will find that in the 50 or 60 million pages that they've opened, there is endless amounts of damning and incriminating things that do not make the state of Israel and its policies look particularly nice. And yet the archives are not, they're not blocking that material for that reason. According to the law, they're not allowed to use that reason. In other words, embarrassing findings are not a legal reason that you're allowed to use in order not to open archival material in Israel. But the fact is that that is not generally what's going on. What's going on is sometimes a broader interpretation of what might harm the state's security and foreign relations than in reality is justified. Those are the two two principles that they're allowed to use. If opening something will harm either the foreign relations or the security of the state of Israel, then the archivists are allowed not to open it. As I said, embarrassing material doesn't fall under that, but they do at times use those interpretations in a broader way than they should be. And there's no political oversight and there's no public oversight. It's very opaque. You can't see what it is that they're not opening because they're not opening it. And there's no way of supervising their internal processes. So that is one part of what's going on. And the second part of what's going on is bureaucratic inertia and non-interest. The current administration of the archives is very excited about adapting AI to archival material, which is indeed a very fascinating topic. And they're putting a lot of effort into that. And they're doing all sorts of other things which are interesting to them and to the system around them, and which are not particularly of interest to the public, which means that even the resources they do have, they do not put as much effort into opening material as they ought to. And the bottom line is that a lot of what the public by law should be allowed to see, it cannot see, or it can see only if researchers are willing to put pressure on them and also to have a lot of patience. And indeed, I'm talking from personal experience. There's material that I ordered 4 years ago, which has not yet been opened. Material that I opened 4 years ago that was open a month later. But there's material opened 4 years ago that has not yet been opened, and it's not going to be opened tomorrow morning. Finally, my last comment. The reality is that at the moment in the entire state of Israel and over the entire globe, there are fewer than 5 people in the entire world who know enough about the laws of archives in Israel and care enough and are willing to stand up to the archives to make a fuss. One of the reasons that the archives allows itself not to hit the schedule and not to do things in a satisfactory way is because they know that nobody is going to complain. That it doesn't make any difference. When I was a state archivist and I would used to say the public demands this to be open, everybody would look at me and they would, as if I was crazy, and they would say, Yaacov, there's no public that wants it to open. There may be an individual researcher, but even the individual researcher isn't going to make a steam. And they were basically right. There are almost no users of the archives who stand up to them, face them, demand from knowledge what the rules really are, and demand that their material be opened. And since there's no public pressure on them, like any other bureaucracy, there's no public pressure on that, and there are other things that they're more interested in, and so they don't do it. And my final comment to that is that my experience has been that when I do argue with them, first of all, they open more material than otherwise. And secondly, when they have redacted parts of a file, and I point out to them that this doesn't make any sense, in about 25% of the cases that I say that, they eventually agree with me and they open the full file. That means 75% of the cases they don't, but it does mean that when you face them, they will back down 25% of the cases, roughly. So my request and suggest is that if any of you out there want to join us, instead of our being 4 or 5 people putting pressure on them, if we could be 50 or 500, it would probably make a difference. And with that, I'm finished for this first.
Thank you very much, Yaacov, knowing it from within and from without. And now, Areej, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amos, for the introduction. And of course, thank you, Deborah, for the organization. I'm grateful for the invitation to speak today on this important panel and to share my insight as a sociologist who has long been working with Israeli and Palestinian archives. My historical sociological findings derive from field work in numerous archives in Israel. Local kibbutz archive of Hashomer Hatzair settlement movement, especially Mishmar HaEmek, Hazoreya, and Ein HaShofet in the Jizra'el Valley, which intensively documented interactions with the ultimately displaced neighboring Palestinian villages, and 5 national archives, Yad Ya'ari Research and Documentation Center, Pinhas Lavon Institute for Labor Movement Research, Haganah Historical Archives, Israeli State Archives, and the Central Zionist Archives. Dedicated to the history of the Zionist settlement, my years of archival mining engaged systematic analysis of assembly protocols, interview files, photographic collections, correspondences, memoirs, eulogies, books that the kibbutzim and other historians produced on their own initiative, and recurring newsletters. I reconstruct the settlement processes on the frontier between 36 and 56, the zenith of the process of Zionist colonization in Palestine and Palestinian resistance, using also post-hoc recollections recorded between 60s and the 90s and preserved in the archives. Through my field work in kibbutz archives, tracing rural land occupation and takeover, I transformed my relationship from one of positivist extraction to one of ethnographic participant observation, realizing that these archives can be useful in explicating the informational mechanisms of settler colonial rule and the Palestinian past. In this talk, I speak to how the Zionist left during the British Mandate and following the Israeli state establishment archived as means of appropriating land and ultimately eliminating neighboring Palestinians from desired space, and in doing so preserved both a history of indigenous presence and of settler colonial violence. I describe this process as archives of apprehension, by which I mean information gathering on the indigenous as a reconnaissance and ethnographic practice of settler colonial conquest, and apprehension as an effective state of anxious archival subjects concerned with the reversibility of settler territorial sovereignty. Kibbutz archives during the British Mandate period and shortly after were organized as a practice of colonization. Local examples from Hashomer Hatzair, the allegedly radical leftist faction within the Zionist settlement movement, and other forms of apprehension, such as the Haganah Village Files project in the 40s, Mandatory Palestine, show how archives of apprehension include what colonization so often aims to eliminate. Even as leftist Zionist archives reflect a selectivity around terms of perpetuation and guilt, they document encounters with and observation of the indigenous, whose resistance shaped inclusion and exclusion in the archive. This talk emerges in response to an epistemic context in Israeli social science and history, in which the critical archival theories long in play in the study of transatlantic slavery and settler colonialism in the Americas and antipodes have only recently trickled into the historical study of Palestine-Israel, generally by way of cultural studies, as positivism largely reigns in historiographic methods. Archives of apprehension can partially recover histories of Palestinian villages and their inhabitants, especially regarding records of life on the frontier, a populated rural zone marked by a collision over land between Jewish settlers, Palestinians, and British forces. I argue that these archives of apprehension can reconstruct the historicity of a protracted colonization otherwise unpreserved. In the case of Palestine-Israel, archives have often been treated as repositories for extracting content on territorial conflict. Most scholars have relied on and continue to rely on elite sources in national Israeli, British, and Arab archives, and therefore depict a macro-political account of 1948 war based on details of battles and war maneuvers. Diplomacy, elite decisions and planning, or demographic and geographic accounts of transformation. This approach sidelined ambivalences, contingency, and local variations. Moreover, it neglects constitutive interactions between settlers and the indigenous that preceded the watershed moment of the 1948 Nakba. To grasp micro and meso-level processes, it is beneficial to consider the resources produced in settler colonial archives. Instrumentalizing such archives for historical sociological work entails examining archival forms and processes of meaning-making alongside attempting to historically situate their functions in the constitution of settler sovereignty. Settler colonial archives are conflict archives in which political violence, physical and epistemic, is synchronically documented and encoded. These partial and fragmented archives vitally disclose otherwise unknowable aspects of indigenous life on the frontier and ultimately of settler colonial governance, including mechanism of classification and attribution. In preserving phenomenological moments of the past, this archive became central to colonizer self-understanding as they work to displace indigenous sovereignty and ensure the irreversibility of settler accumulations. Archive of apprehension should be formulated and reconstructed as a set of tools to trace colonization practices and to potentially reappropriate indigenous historicity. Prior to Israeli founding in 1948, Zionist colonial nuclei in the populated frontier prepared for land purchase by gathering detailed information about the Palestinian villages, geography, typography, demography, political activity, customs, and culture, a strategy that enabled the Zionist movement, albeit minimal, initial foothold in late Ottoman and mandatory Palestine. The Zionist colonies, among these those of Hashomer Hatzair, came to constitute pockets of a semi-sovereign rule nested within British imperial rule. The archival institution and ethnographic practices of apprehension that appeared throughout the Zionist movement contributed to a colonial informational field used to entrench surveillance and control. The goal was to ascertain territorial irreversibility in the rural frontier and to consolidate contiguous presence outside urban centers. These archives then would merge the history of the settler colonizer and the indigenous as dialectically intertwined, especially on the constitutive violence enacted against the indigenous population in practices of land control and resistance to replacement. Kibbutz settlers faced the question of how to frame the story of the existence and ultimate disappearance of the Palestinian villages nested beside them. I want to share a screen showing, I hope I can share. If you are with me, it's just 1 second and I think it will share. Can you see the screen? I'm sorry, it's slow, but a second and I will be with you. Can you see the screen? Yes? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Take a look at how the Kibbutz archive documents each Arab village that it helped to displace on a large map hanging prominently on the wall in the entrance of the Kibbutz archive. A representational discourse of the Palestinian Arab villages shaped how settlers perceived the history of the indigenous and their exit. As Hashomer Hatzair settlers articulated indigenous life, their information gathering practices became a legitimation mechanisms as they attempt to reconfigure Palestinian history as prehistory and as they became intensely interested in the question of the Palestinian ethnic origins. The colonial archive captures the displaced Palestinian villages just as it restructures the historical narrative. Representation of the Palestinian villages and their inhabitants persisted in the archive despite systematic endeavors to silence what preceded, the destruction of property, renaming of places, and etc. Many of the kibbutz archives contain media collections with images of the later displaced Palestinian villages and kibbutz member encounters with the Palestinian indigenous in the vicinity. At Kibbutz Ain HaShofet archive, for instance, I located photographs of the one-time Palestinian village, Ju'ara, a hilltop village which the kibbutz colony subsumed in 1937 after its residents were displaced. I will share. Can you see the screen? Amos? Yes? Great. This is the Palestinian village, Ju'ara, I actually discovered in the archive. Neither Ju'ara nor its occupation appear in Israeli and Palestinian historical sources on the displaced Palestinian villages, and yet detailed records of these villages and others that elsewhere are lost remains in the kibbutz archive. Another instance is in the project of the Village Files, a compilation of documents containing detailed information about the Palestinian villages and cities in mandatory Palestine collected by the Haganah, the Zionist pre-state militia, between 1943 and 1948. The project's astounding levels of cartographic, visual, and discursive detail can still be found in the Haganah historical archives, facilitated by hundreds of Haganah scouts, reconnaissance commanders, and intelligence officers. The settler militia apparatus, inclusive of leftist kibbutz settlers and Arab experts, sought to apprehend the basic structure of the Arab village in their terms. Even as the settlers' goals for the file morphed over time, scouts surveyed the village topographic, geographic, architecture, sociocultural, and political features, including infrastructural elements like roads, land, quality, water sources, and demographic data, including religious affiliation and age details of the male population. Informant sketches, villages, maps, and viewpoints. In my field work investigating the Hashomer HaTzair colonies at Haganah Historical Archives, I encountered thousands of files detailing a range of information about the Palestinian villages, among them those that neighbored the kibbutzim I examined. Files detailed anything from Ju'ara, from Abu Zreq village, newly planted fruit trees, or the number of students enrolled in its girls' schools, to the location of 29 Arab coffee houses in Haifa, where political activity was presumed to take place, to the names and ages of the Arab activists in Tantura obtained from an informant. This slide that I'm showing now depicts the first page of Abu Zreq file, Abu Zreq village, neighbored Kibbutz Hazoreya, with minute categorization of location, origin, water sources, family structures, and so on, are characteristic of the apprehension practices. And these two images, this one and the other one, are drawings created by Haganah scouts on Yagur village. Efforts to apprehend, just a second, I see there is, okay. Efforts to apprehend the Palestinians are important resources, not least because they outline how Zionist leftists on the frontier understood themselves. There are numerous there are numerous possible explanations for the relative hyper-inclusion of settler colonial violence and indigenous life. First, including the Palestinian neighbors' presence and their relation with the kibbutz contributed to the construction of the settlers' brotherhood of people ideology, a value Hashomer Hatzair often professed alongside their value of class liberation. For these leftists, the archive reflected and produced their self-perception by preserving the Palestinian villages in archival form. Even as the villages were being displaced, they simultaneously recognized and disavowed the settlement role in the village distraction. The constant colonial anxiety over impairments, reinforced by persistent violent skirmishes, required irritative reaffirmation of the colonial legitimacy and the Zionist militia attempt to secure it. Second, the inclusion forms part of an appropriation cum substitution process. Settlers did not express feeling jeopardized by their explicit inclusion of the Palestinian past. They legitimized their practices of territorialization and their right to claim space by delinking Palestinians as non-sovereign, non-historical, unrooted, and unproductive from the land. The kibbutz settlers substantiated their claims by linking themselves to contiguous Jewish history, extending to ancient time to position their claim to land as indisputable. They also aligned their right to belonging with Hashomer Hatzair's socialist Zionist claims that land belonged to those who productively worked it. Therefore, the Palestinian, whom these settlers believed to be unproductive, despite their long history of cultivation, were not deemed legitimate possessors of desired space, and their inclusion in archival form posed no threat of a redistribution. Third and last, some leftist Zionist settlers expressed on few occasions and in various locations across the archive effects of uneasiness and hunting over their own actions and or over the sordid fate of their previous Palestinian neighbors. Including the Palestinian in the archive then may be one way the settlers attempted to preserve this past and all its features to depict what they termed an inevitable and intentional outcome. And last, hyper-inclusion in the archives fits entirely the Zionist policy of details. Palestine was not only the promised land, it was a specific territory with a specific characteristic that was surveyed down to the last millimeter, settled on, planned for in detail, as Edward Said argues. Zionist settler historiography has dual function: to inhabit the claims of settler illegitimacy on one hand, and to preserve the history of settler violence on the other hand. Thereby, settler colonial archives are a significant but totally inadequate resource that can be called upon to revive a past elsewhere denied. Such archives offer tools to challenge the inevitability of colonization and the violence of disposition. Through the attempt to collect and eternalize settler national sovereignty, such a process paradoxically and dialectically preserve indigenous collective presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Areej. We have already a number of questions, and I asked you also to prepare questions to each other, but let's first go to the audience that have. So I will collect together a couple of questions. I think mostly both of you, but you decide what you. So many ask about those things that are not open. Can the speakers give an idea of what is the unavailable part of the archive? In other words, what are the authorities trying to hide and what are the mechanisms? Another question in this direction is particularly for Dr. Lozowick. One example of the unavailable parts would be the Haganah photographer Shraga Peled's photos taken in April 1948 during the Deir Yassin massacre. Documentary movie maker Neta Shoshani and many others have tried to have looked at these photos during the years, but the requests have always been denied. So will the kind of material from 1947, 1949 war ever be released? So, and there are several more questions on what is unavailable. So perhaps you start, Yaacov, and then Areej, you add your jump in and add your what unmute.
Yes, sorry about that. First of all, in the State Archive, there's almost nothing from 1948 which is still sealed. And nor should there be. There's no law that would allow it still to be sealed up to more than this. It's almost 75 years. In the State Archive, so as I said, that's, I mean, I suppose there may be a file here or there that somebody missed or for whatever reason, but there's no policy of hiding material from 1948. The fact of the matter is that in the State Archive, there's no policy of hiding information at all. There is in the State Archive and in the Military Archive, what is hidden is much more a question of what they have not yet gotten to and they're not in any hurry to get to. I'll give you an example. The protocols of the cabinet meetings, according to law, should be open up until 1992 because they remain sealed for 30 years, and 92 to 23 that's the 30-year period. So it should be that all the cabinet meetings from 1948 until 1992 should all be open. In reality, they're open until 1977, and from 1977 on, they're not open. Is this a policy decision to say that we're not going to open what was done from the Begin government onwards? I don't think so. I honestly don't think that that's what's going on. Opening cabinet protocols is a lengthy process. Two different people have to read it. A third person has to look over at what they did. It's a lot of work. They're not in any particular hurry to do so. This is very aggravating. But I don't think it's a policy of saying we don't want people to know what the Begin government was doing. As a general statement, I would say even in the Military Archive, which is far more sealed than the State Archive, even in the Military Archive, there is rarely a policy of saying we don't want this sort of material to be open. To a certain extent, in the Military Archive, there is indeed military material from 1948, which is not yet open. There is a lot of material in the State Archive, in the Military Archive from more recent years, which isn't open. I mean, I will be the first to admit that this is very frustrating and aggravating, but I have to say that I think it is more a question of focusing their limited resources on things that interest them rather than things that interest the public, more than a policy of this is what we want to hide. I don't think that they're, certainly not in the State Archive. In the Military Archive, I don't know, but in the State Archive, there is no policy that says we're going to hide the events of 1948 or 1967 or anything else of the sort. It's a question of they don't care enough and the public is not putting pressure on them, and so they're not getting around to doing it.
Areej, do you want to add something?
I think I want to add another layer of what Yaacov said. Thank you, Yaacov. I think, first of all, the question is not about hiding or not. It's not just that. First of all, how the percentage of materials that are exposed in these archives, they, as far as I know, they don't exceed 5%. This is first. So the general information from the archives are just 5%. So we have 95%, around 95% that are not open to the public. The second thing is, I'm not sure about your opinion, Yaacov, about they rarely hide information or etc. I myself find in different files places where a paper was added, a file was removed from here, especially after the archive were opened and there were information about 48, the Nakba, and etc. So this is one. The second thing, Amos, I think we should, the question that we should raise is also which kind of archive we are looking for and for which, what is the aim of this? As I said in my talk, and I want to ascertain that these state archived as the State Archive or the Hagan or etc., they give us just a general pictures. And if we go to the local archives, the one that I examined, they really expose a different kind of history, of past, of information, and the possibility to read against the archival grain. That means not just what they aim by the collections of these archival material is more open to us. So I would move from the question of hiding or not, because I think, and the other people, actually Benny Morris himself talks about, for example, how the Zionist leaders would themselves, through their writing, their preserving the protocols of committees. Ben-Gurion himself in his diaries would eliminate part of what they in the beginning wrote in these journals or in these minutes. So the question is, for me, is to deconstruct and to read critically the archives. It's not just what they include, but how we read them, what are the information that we can extract from them.
I would agree with Areej. She's right. I have no argument with what she said, and different levels of historical documentation contain different types of information. And what she's describing is a way of very intelligently analyzing what's in there in order to see the outlines of what's not in there. That's great. That's good historical research. It doesn't change the fact that the archives are open or not open.
But Yaacov, what about this committee that I don't know if you mentioned it, that unlawfully censors the archives and screens the archives and censor it unlawfully?
No, I don't. There is no such committee. Not that I'm aware of. There's a process again in the military archives. They have a committee which has no legal standing, but it's very much there, which decides in the case of each researcher if they're going to be helpful or not, which is totally illegal. And I've told them any number of times that this is illegal, but they continue doing it, and that's the way it is. But there's no committee which is deciding that this or that can't be open. What there is a process of checking files before they're open to the public. And some of that was done many years ago. When Areej says, correctly, she's right. When Areej says that she gets files that have entire pages removed, she's right. But the fact is, those files were the pages were probably removed in the 1990s, or maybe even in the 1980s, or certainly 20 years ago. And if you say to them, wait a minute, that you could have done that then, but you can't do it now, they will back up. They'll back off. I had this experience with the military archive last week. They sent me a pile of files. It took me a long time to get them, but they sent me a pile of files, about 20,000 pages of files, and there were about 760 pages that were it said that they were removed. And I said to them, what's going on? You can't do that. That's illegal. And they said, you're right, Yaacov, but the files were checked in 2006. And in 2006, it was still legal because it was less than 50 years. And since you call our attention to the fact, we will now go and re-examine those files. And I assume that they're probably open most of the pages. This will take months. It's a waste of their time and mine. It's aggravating. But, and this is what I said before, if there were more users who were who knew the law and insisted that they live according to the law, they would be more careful.
Yaacov, not Yaacov, sorry, Amos, can I add a small thing about the digitization, Yaacov? I would think, I think we need to complicate our perspective of the digitization and make the archive accessible to public, because if we try to deeply understand this process. I see it as part of surveillance, that the original materials, before they're digitizing, are scrutinized to the public. I am afraid that this process might take out further information, further files that we as researchers can approach them differently. This is first. Second, Amos, if you may let me, I see one question from Dr. Tal about the significance of using left in this case. Tal, this is the question I address deeply in my book, but here I want to say that the leftist movement that quote unquote believed in settling Palestine in peaceful ways, this is actually allegedly what they said, this for understanding the archives is much more interesting, because the Palestinians are always present in interaction with these movements. So the question of left here is in the archive, specifically dealing with the archives, I think, and according to my work in different archives, the leftist archives, quote unquote leftist, Zionist leftist, include more information about the Palestinians because they address also the question, the Arabic question, intensely, and they are occupied with. So in terms of how these archives can help us reconstruct the Palestinian house, it's beneficial. But as to the other question about left, I will leave it to my book because it will take more time from me to explain. Amos, you are still muted.
Thank you. So let's take one very brief question, and I encourage also the public, the audience, to search the website of Akevot, who do an extensively and impressive work in the archives, and search there and see the reports on various topics that we have discussed here. So Google Akevot and see how AKOVET and AOVOT, and you can see it there. A very brief question to you, Areej. Lars Andersen, and please we have 1 minute to answer it. Asks, taking the history is told by the oppressor victors at face value and seeking an alternative narrative, what forms of archival or historical knowledge are available from Palestinian perspectives, either through oral history or less institutional means of information collection? Please be brief because we have only 1 minute.
I just want to say that the answer to this is I can share in an article that I published, which is Settler Colonialism and the Archives of Apprehension, where I based my talk on. I can't relate to this question, but the oral history projects by the Palestinian Institute and different Palestinian institutes are very important and crucial oral history projects, and the family files, of course, and there are other Palestinian documents and resources I think that should be including while we write the history of Palestine and the Palestinian. I myself did around 50 oral history interviews, and this will be on my second book project.
Okay, thank you very much, Areej. Thank you very much, Yaacov, and back to you, Deborah.
And I add my thanks. Thank you, Areej, Yaacov, and Amos for the work each of you does, for these fabulous presentations, for your participation in this event. Indeed, many thanks to everyone, speakers and listeners for joining today. The conversation prompts all of us to think and to think anew and to send in requests to to the archive for the opening of documents. So I thank you and have a good evening all, those who are in Jerusalem, and a good afternoon for those of us in New York. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and everyone. Thank you.